Hey everyone, it's been a while. It's been about a year and a half since my last upload, and I kind of missed it. I really wanted to do more with it, and I just wasn't sure where to take it next. I went through a bunch of different ideas, threw different things around, did a bunch of research, and the more that I learned, the less that I wanted to do another project like that. Because I didn't know where I wanted to go and I didn't know which singular topic best to advance with or to progress the series with. I didn't know where I wanted to take it. I wanted I wanted this to be more educational, and I wasn't satisfied with just throwing out a proverb here and there and talking about that. I wanted to do stuff that other people aren't really doing as much. I wanted to challenge people's worldview. I wanted to give something thought provoking. I wanted to leave an impression. So, what better way to start us off than talking about the beginning? Genesis 1 tells us, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. But then the next verse, the world was formless and without any kind of character, it was void. So, we immediately go from the creator to next the creation. We have earth and mankind. What we also get are the creation of the celestial lights. We get the sun, moon, and stars. Now, all of that is important because they are made with a specific purpose in mind. The sun and moon are each lights to rule the day and night, but they're lights, plural. Even in the language that's used, it's implied that the moon gives off its own light. Also implied is the fact that the moon's light gives off a very different feeling than the sunlight. If you actually look at it, it's interesting. Moonlight actually has a cooling effect on the world. Of course, opposite, you have the sun with its own sort of heating light. So you have a heat and a cooling effect. It balances out. And then you also have the stars, which are in the sky always, watching over us, especially at night. You see them. And in those stars, you have constellations, groups of them. Now, one constellation that seems prominent, let's say, is that of Orion. Orion the Hunter. Now, at this point in time, I haven't done a ton of research into Orion himself. However, what I do know is that Orion has his belt of three stars. And on that belt, if you'll notice, it matches the pyramids perfectly. Their alignment, they match the constellation Orion in the sky. What you'll find is that their belief was that, one, this constellation is deeply connected to the god Osiris, and I will go into that later, who exactly Osiris was. But not only that, you get the idea that that represents the Duat, the afterlife, the place where souls go to rest. The idea being that the soul would travel up through the pyramid, through a window, which is mostly inaccessible, and the hole that exists on the outside is aimed directly at Orion's belt, exactly where the soul was said to go after death. Now, I want to connect a lot of things together. So, next we have the idea of Amentet. Amentet is the land of the West. It's also signified as being the underworld, looked over by Anubis. Now, what's interesting about Amentet is that it's described, like I said, as being the land of the West. What was west of Egypt? Well, you could say Mauritania, the Berber tribes of northern Africa, but I believe it's referring to something even farther west. Amentet. Amenti, the land of the underworld. This kind of correlates with ideas you hear about Atlantis. You hear about this land of the West, just outside of the Strait of Gibraltar. The Pillars of Heracles, that's how it's described. The land of Amentet was beyond the pillars, much like Atlantis is described as being. Now, where things get a little interesting is how Atlantis is described. Most people will tell you that the origin of our idea of Atlantis comes from Plato. You'll hear that it comes from Timaeus and Critias, these two different dialogues that were composed by Plato. What you'll find is that despite the scholarly arguments and despite the disagreement with the mythological point of view, the disregarding of mythology, if you actually read the texts, they are described in extraordinary detail. Detail that is far too deep for allegory. Either that, or it's very literally describing what would be an adversary in the past or in the future, in the present time, such as Persia with the Ionian Revolt and the Persian Wars that followed. It could be an allusion to that, but I seriously doubt it, because as we know, Persia was not west of the Pillars of Heracles, nor was Persia on an island. The idea that this land beyond the Mediterranean existed to the west is not new. A lot of different people have had that same idea. Now, all of these things seem kind of disparate right now. I promise. It's going to get better. But all of these things have to be set before you begin to kind of understand how to link them all together. This is going to be a broad, overlying idea of research. So, keep Atlantis in mind. What happened with Atlantis? Well, we know from Critias and Timaeus that Atlantis was ruled by the god Poseidon. He is the founder, in a sense, of Atlantis, the god of the sea. It makes sense because Atlantis was said to be an island. That would lend itself to a lot more of a port society, such as like New York, where much of its power comes in its mercantile capability. Of course, Poseidon would be their patron deity. It would make sense, as most of their trade, most of their money comes from being on the water. Interestingly, this sounds a lot like how Phoenician society was set up. We can get into that later, but for now, just keep the Phoenicians in mind. Now, Poseidon had sons. He had 10 sons, if I'm not mistaken, and these would be the 10 kings of Atlantis. I believe the oldest of which was named Atlas, and he was the son of Poseidon and Cleito. This is where we get the word Atlantic from. Even in antiquity, at least to some degree, there was knowledge that Atlas, the land of Atlas, lied beyond the Mediterranean, lied beyond Europe and Africa and the world that was known at the time. The reason for this is because flood myths have existed around the world since as far back as we can remember. Every society has an idea of a flood myth. Whether you want to look at China, whether you want to look at India, whether you want to look at even the Greeks. And then, of course, the most famous and the most recognizable, I believe, would be from the Bible, with the story of Noah. This is not a study in telling you that the Bible is true about everything. What I'm trying to do is make the world's mythologies make sense. They seem disparate and they seem incongruent in a lot of ways. But if you start recognizing the themes and the motifs and the stories and the characters, you start to see a very similar sort of picture forming. Now, while you may be thinking that the Epic of Gilgamesh would be the primary sort of source on this thing, I'm not convinced that the Epic of Gilgamesh matches up with the biblical narrative. I believe it describes something slightly different, and I'll get into that in a bit. But not only that, it's difficult to say which account is truly oldest. If you look at these different religions around the world, these different modes of faith in these different societies, many of them hail from oral tradition. So there wasn't a sort of lexical or written copy that was widely available. A lot of these things were told through pictures and diagrams and verbal stories over time. They didn't have to be written down. The tradition carried it, and they were so widely known that the story remained mostly consistent over time. But then you have these different stratifications that you get in these different societies where the story changes somewhat, or the names change, or there's a slightly different world that's being described, which I would guess each reflects the culture that they were created in. That's not to say any one of them are wrong, but each of them holds a piece of the truth. All of these societies around the world contain a story of their foremost civilization existing on an island somewhere. And after a great cataclysm, the survivors left and repopulated the earth and spread out from there. What you don't really get is the reason why the flood happened. This is where a lot of things start coming into play that I need to start introducing. So, for one, right at the beginning, if you remember, God created man on, I think it was the sixth day, and on the seventh day he rested. After that, you have a couple generations of peace, up until you get to the point of Genesis 6. This is where things start to change. So at this point, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days. Now, who were the Nephilim? They were the result of the union of the sons of God and the daughters of men. What might seem like fanciful language, I believe, is almost describing literally how this is to be understood. If you look at the example of a Tygon and a Liger, you have one crossover that creates an animal that is roughly the same size as the adults of both species, the tiger and the lion. The Tygon is a more normal being because what they've actually found is that both of the species, both of the genders of each of the respective species, carries a growth inhibitor gene. One sex from each species carries it. So, when you have a liger, what you end up seeing is that neither of the parents of that offspring had a growth inhibitor gene. What ends up happening is you create an animal that is essentially a giant. It has no growth inhibition, which means that it will grow respective to whatever you feed it. If you keep feeding the liger, it will continue to grow, and very often ligers end up being larger than both parents, just because of how the growth inhibitor gene works. Take that to be the sons of God and the daughters of men, so you have a genetic basis for how this union can occur, with the sons of God being the divine direct creations of God, I believe, which is a good way of looking at it. Some people will say that the sons of God is a reference to the line of Seth, and that the daughters of men is an allusion to the line of Cain. If you remember, Cain had a curse set on him after he murdered his brother Abel. But then Adam and Eve had another child named Seth that was named, and his line is mainly where the Israelites hail from. There's a bunch of people around the world, they had more children, Adam and Eve did. So it's not to say that that is where everyone came from, but that is where, I suppose if you wanted to say it, the legendary lineage came from. It's from the line of Seth. What I end up taking out of that is that the sons of God are direct creations of God. You'll also get the idea of that from Job, where Satan, or the devil, approaches God with the proposition, of course, of testing Job, but he approaches God in the presence of a couple sons of God. Now, I take that as being these sons of God that approached with the devil are these fallen angels that are mentioned at the beginning of time, which fell with Satan. He took a third of the stars with him. Now, that we're already going back to the beginning of what I was talking about. If a third of the stars from heaven fell, which is also mentioned in Revelation, by the way, this falling away would have been a great number of angels that followed along with Satan's uprising. So these direct creations of God, with Lucifer being another one, or at least Satan, as we want to call him that, all of these figures are aligned together. The sons of God, the fallen angels, the stars, and Satan. Now, I thought the stars were just lights in the sky. It's interesting that they're personified. Not even just in the sense of the constellation, but even deeper than that. The stars have fallen, meaning they have almost their own free will in doing so, implying that there's some life to them. Well, what's more is you get the idea, even science will tell you, that all the celestial bodies, all the stars that we have, isn't it odd that they're all named after mythological gods and goddesses and demigods and creatures? Why is that? Are the planets the gods? Are these lights in the heavens our rulers of this terrestrial realm? Or what are we supposed to take from that? Why are all of them named after these mythological figures? Something to consider. So, moving on, this original land was so wicked it needed to be destroyed. Now, what would make it deserving of that? When the Bible says that there was much wickedness on the earth in those days, and there was only evil in the hearts of men continually. Some people would say that that's not too far off from where we are now. But what I say is, how much have things changed? If you look at, I think it's Matthew who says, "As in the days of Noah, so too shall the coming of man be." Something along those lines. Now, there's no Nephilim around. So how can it possibly be like the days of Noah? We're probably far away from Jesus coming back, right? Maybe. Whatever these doomsday people will tell you. What's frightening is once you realize who the Nephilim are, you start to realize we are approaching that time more and more all the time. Now, the Nephilim were these unions of man and God, being half man, half divine, semi-immortal. You get the stories of people like Achilles and Hercules. A lot of these giants, these Nephilim, are thought to be one and the same. If you look at, I believe, the King James Version of the Bible, every time you see the word Nephilim or anything related to them, whether they be descendants or even them themselves, they're called giants. That's a mistranslation error, and it's unfortunate that it's made it this deep into Christian ideology. While it's true that yes, many of them were giants, it's also true that not all of them were. What's also true is that later on in the Bible you get an instance where the Bible talks about King Og of Bashan. Now, if you read it, it says that King Og was the last of the giants. That doesn't quite make much sense, because then you get the account of Goliath, I believe, later on. But not only that, if you actually look at the word that's used, it's that King Og was the last of the Rephaim, not the last of the giants. The word Rephaim comes from the word Rapha. There's also an area called Gilgal Rephaim in the Middle East, and it looks like a big circle. where not much is known, but with a name like Rephaim, I can only assume that giants used to live here. So, these giants, these demigods, these heroes, these mighty hunters, whatever you wish to call them, were all across the world. And I can only assume that they were the ones that created much of this evil and darkness. Partially because the fathers of these demigods were the fallen angels, which rebelled against God and against the natural order, and had children with mankind as they were not supposed to. So, this unholy union created these great beings, but these great beings were extremely corrupted. While I believe they were probably some of the most intelligent beings to ever exist on this planet because of their divine nature, they were also some of the most cruel. If you look at the liger, it is always hungry, always looking for food. It's never satisfied. It will keep growing as much as you feed it. And it's much the same with the giants in this world. They would eat and eat and eat. And eventually there came a time where they had eaten up all of the world's resources that they could manage to find, and there wasn't enough to share for everyone. And then they started eating people, and there was great violence in the world, unlike anything we've ever seen before. These giants ruling the world, all having their own kingdoms, and mankind being subject to them. All the while procreating and spreading their, I would say, corrupted seed across the world. These giant bloodlines, these Nephilim, Rephaim bloodlines continued. And while the flood wiped many of them out, as well as the ensuing giant wars that killed many of the giants as they fought each other for resources, what you ended up getting was an extinction event of these things. But there's a reason I didn't include Gilgamesh in the stories I listed earlier. It's because I believe Gilgamesh himself was a demigod. And you could probably also say the same about Deucalion, the Greek version. Now, these demigods would have been a giant. And wouldn't you know, in every depiction of Gilgamesh, he's large in stature. You can say that he's just made that way as a means of making him more prominent. But then if you look at different depictions of Egypt, I'm thinking of one in particular, the men who push the boats are much bigger. The same with the servants in the field. Are these people more important than the pharaoh? Is that the implication? Using animals for reference only makes it worse. What's really going on here? What we do know is that these giants created a huge force in the world. They were the master builders of their age. And if you look closely, you can see their influence all over the world, these giants. They were the ones, I believe, that built these great structures. Perhaps the pyramids, I believe Stonehenge, and perhaps even these cathedrals that we see around the world. These impossible feats of masonry and architecture which you've never seen before, and that we frankly would find it difficult to replicate today, let alone how often these things cropped up around the world and how common they were. If you remember, there used to be more cathedrals throughout the world, especially in America, but many of them were destroyed over time in the things like the World's Fair. These temples, all but destroyed. Now, I could be wrong on all this. That's fine. I'm just throwing theories out and throwing out ideas. Conclusions that I've come to based on the research that I've done. Now, what would the benefit be of erasing these giants from history? Well, for one, the Bible and all of mythology is mythologized. It's relegated to legend. None of the things in these mythologies could have happened if the characters weren't giants, or at least some of them. Or at least some of the conflicts weren't related to giants. If you know about the Canaanite conquests in, I believe, Numbers, as well as through Joshua, the Canaanites there were said to make the Israelites look like grasshoppers because they were so large. So, how in the world did that happen? Well, easy example, Gilgamesh. If Gilgamesh survived the flood and he was saved by his deity, then what you have is a new line of giants created after the flood. And there's the explanation. That's how, at least how some pockets of them grew. And you also have stories of giants in the Gobi Desert. You have stories of giants all around the world. The Native Americans in different pockets spoke of giants. So you have giants all around the world being described, and yet no historical or fossil evidence. Well, how can that be? Well, there were many discoveries made during the Age of Exploration. The conquistadors found gold, rich vegetation, and people who already lived there with their own history and religion, which was oddly reminiscent of their own in some ways, but was far darker, including sacrifice and blood rituals. The histories of these people have been largely erased, purposefully, I believe. Again, like I said, relegated to legend. Erasure in the form of conquest. When the Spaniards arrived, much of the history of the Native Americans went with them, as they died in droves from whether it be by the sword or by disease. Much of the history was lost, and much of it was purposefully exterminated, specifically the history of the Maya, which was thankfully saved in the Popol Vuh. And if you actually read the Popol Vuh, it sounds remarkably like the Genesis account, at least parts of it. And that's where everything sort of connects a lot more. Even the Maya and the Aztecs and the Inca had ideas of these giants ahead of time, before the conquistadors ever knew. Well, anything they had before they had contact, allegedly. So, not only that, in the 1800s, you can look this up, but there were dozens, probably even hundreds, of different news articles printed out that detailed different mounds where giants were found. And this happened all across the US. Some notable examples, I think, happened in Ohio, where these giant graves were found. And the bones were found, they were recorded, they were measured, and then not too long after that, the bones were collected by museum systems, big organizations headed up by the Smithsonian, where they would come in, they would take the bones, and you would hear nothing more about it. And things like that still happen now, where you hear a lot about a different discovery that was made in a certain town or a village somewhere or a city, and then they find it, they send it away to a lab, and they say you'll get results in the future, and then you never do. You never get results. And I believe that's how you know when it's legitimate, when there's no proof coming back. Because if they were to try to negate it with their facts, they would be wrong. They would have to fabricate it. An easier way of doing that would just be letting it die, letting the story die and hiding the evidence away, which becomes even more perplexing. Why hide a society's history from them? Because if you control the past, you control the present. Well, if you control the present, you control the past, you can make the past whatever you want it to be. Even further, you control the future. If you control the present moment, you control the past and the future. You dictate what happened and what's going to happen, because you have all the information at your fingertips. What then do? Do you trust their history that they give you? Or do you seek out a different one in your own light, in the light of your own knowledge, in the light of your own world experience rather than the life experience that's been dictated to you over time? What makes this difficult is that we live in a world full of lies and misinformation, and it's especially easy to find with the internet. But the problem is we've lost our way historically. From the ancient time in Atlantis, whatever that is, the ancient land where we all hail from, that was destroyed, and then we all emerged out of in these different societies. The reason for the flood being the giants, and the reason for the giants being the original sin that opens us up to influence by these darker entities. And the more that we give them power, the more they can control. What's become somewhat controversial is the fact that the Bible says that there were Nephilim on the earth in those days and also after, giving the idea that before and after the flood there were giants. So where are the giants now? We don't see any. But I don't believe they're extinct. Not by a long shot. You get stories from around the world of these different caves underground where these 10-foot skeletons are found, and it's quickly hushed up and you never hear about it again. You have to be very careful about what you see, about what you hear, and what you share. And I'm trying to be as careful as I can, while being as honest as I can. And the scariest part is the apocalypse that is said to be coming. Where we are in time is difficult to determine. The calendars haven't really been properly set, I think. And you'll have evidence coming up all over of these phantom gaps in time, specifically things like the Dark Ages, where supposedly nothing really happened for hundreds of years, during which time was the fallout of one of the largest empires to ever exist, creating a vacuum of power and resources that would have likely crippled the world economy at the time, considering the reliance on trade and trade routes with the Roman roads. Instead, what you see is very little archaeological evidence outside of the sudden emergence of grand architecture like cathedrals and arches. Romanesque, it's called, but this is in the wake of the fall of the empire. How does that make sense with the Dark Age if the architecture doesn't seem to match the lack of record? Where would this education for this kind of building have come from? And because there's such a difference between what's actually written about the Dark Ages, with them being a period of regression rather than progression in the historical timeline, and essentially European collapse, the difference between what you get in architecture and what you get in actual written records would make some people consider that the timeline is incorrect, or it's flawed, or there's gaps that need to be filled. What we're dealing with is a much shorter timeline of human civilization, where things are collapsed on top of each other. Different empires occurred at the same time you wouldn't have expected. Another point to kind of underpin this is that a lot of the world history is based on Egyptian chronology. They have the long and short version, essentially, but even the short version, I believe, is too long. What's not taken into account are the various co-regencies, which happen very commonly in different parts of the world, where the Egyptians had their influence. And these pharaohs, I believe, were many of the time co-regents, meaning that they had an overlap in their regnal years. So what we have is not a distinct reign of however many years. What we have is this overlap in time where several people are ruling at once in different areas, which would dramatically shorten the timeline. Now, that could be true. It also might not. But it's something to consider that what we have, what we're dealing with time wise, is a lot of lies and a lot of misdirection. We live in a magical world, and while I wish that some of the things in it weren't as dark as they are, I would rather be living in a world of facts rather than of lies and fiction created for our comfort. One final thing I want to bring about and talk about is the idea of Nimrod. Now, Nimrod was the grandson of Ham, I believe. He was the son of Cush. So sometime after the ark, not very long, you have Nimrod coming to power. Now it's said that he was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Now what that means is you have to look back at the words used with the Nephilim. These were mighty men of renown. This is the indication that they were giants. Nimrod was a giant, and he is responsible for founding some of the world's kingdoms after the dispersion, after the building of the Tower of Babel. You have the Great Dispersion, which is where everyone had their languages confused and they spread throughout the world. Nimrod was in power at that time. Now, what's somewhat scary is the fact that this Nimrod figure, he was also called Bel or Belus. He was also called Baal. And this figure of Nimrod being Baal became the center of worship for much of the world for a long period of time. And this same figure went by different names, like Moloch, I believe. Just different interpretations of the same deity. And the worship of Baal, of Moloch, involves human sacrifice, specifically that of infant children, which would be the best for the sacrifice, as it's the most innocent and the most pure, and essentially the closest to God. The blood of an innocent is even more sweet to these demons. So, what you have are the worship of these Nephilim giant figures, the primary of which being Baal or Nimrod. And if we're to believe that when the coming of the Son of Man is, being, I suppose, the return of Christ, when that happens, we should have a resurgence of these Nephilim figures, primary of which was Baal. And if there is anything that I know about American architecture, it's that we can't seem to get away from him, even in our modern sensibilities. If you look right outside the stock market on Wall Street, you have a bull, supposedly representing a bull market. But what did Baal represent? Fertility and influence and resources. If you want abundance in the next year, you sacrifice the greatest to Baal, to Nimrod, which would be your firstborn, typically. And then you would be blessed in abundance and wealth and resources, and that's typically how it goes. Now, why would people do that if it's just a bunch of hippy dippy mumbo jumbo from 3,000 years ago? Well, why does anyone do anything? Because it gets them the result they want. So now you're faced with the idea of how magical is this world that we're dealing with? Objective reality, that only the things that you can see. If you base your entire life off of objective reality, you are lost. Because there's an unseen world that we're not privy to immediately with our limited spectral vision. For those that have the eye to see, it will be seen. This ancient world and how it connects to now and how we are and how things will progress. Otherwise, it will seem like the ramblings of a bunch of crazy ancient people. But how far will we go in doubting the history that these people have written down for us, and how much corruption will we allow into it? We don't know when we are, we don't know where we are, and as much as science likes to say that we know all these things, we know very, very little. Take, for example, the ocean. We say we've conquered the world, and I say that most of the ocean, much of the waterways in the world are unexplored. And then you hear about things like the bloop, or this monstrous creature in the Mariana Trench, the Leviathan. I'm not sure it's the Leviathan. I can't say for sure. So, what of that size could survive at those depths? Unless we're dealing with something that we truly don't understand. What was it? Even in the prior century, in the 20th century, we discovered the coelacanth, which was thought to be extinct for millions of years. If our ideas of reality are constantly being challenged, who are any of us to say what the truth of the world is unless we can know it for ourselves? I'd like this to be the starting off point for the rest of the series that I do in the future. I want to get this out so that it's out and that people maybe can see it and start to get an interest in it. I'd like this to be my first step because you got to start somewhere. And what better way than summarizing the world altogether? Of course, I'll go into specifics about all these things in the future, and I will probably do specific videos on these things, and um, I'll be looking at these things more in depth. I don't want to waste your time, and I don't want to make what I say seem fantastical to the point where it's beyond belief and it's merely for entertainment. It is. It's for entertainment. But I want you to look at mythology in a different way because we really don't live in a boring world. Everything is beautiful, especially when you begin to appreciate it more. How far we've come as a species and where we are in time, how much we've conquered to be where we are, how much we've lost and had to sacrifice to be where we are and understand who we are. And the greatest tragedy is we've lost most of that knowledge over time. We've forgotten who we are, and we have to return. So, in the aim of returning, I pray that you'll consider all of this, keep it in mind. Don't take my word for it. Please do your own research and understand that this world is greater than anyone could ever fathom. Keep the faith and keep your wits about you. Be safe, and God bless you.